Hello and good evening, everyone. It is July 31st, 2023. Welcome to the Policy Committee meeting for Community Unit School District 303. It is 4:32 p.m. We'll go ahead and do we have any citizens comments? I believe no. No citizens comments. So moving on to item 2A, the policy updates for discussion. Dr. Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Kuchert. So we'll start off with policy 280, board member oath and conduct. This policy is a part of the 5-year review with no changes, and you're going to hear that quite a bit tonight. Some legal updates or no changes. So I'll go through there, and please stop me if you have any questions on any policy. So policy 2110, qualifications, terms, and duties of board members. This policy reflects a revised language that you're going to hear probably 3 or 4 different times in different policies all around an employment history review. And this is that background check that you'll hear on employees, but also for board members as well. So that will be that new addition to 2110. Policy 2170, procurement of architectural, engineering, and land surveying services. Again, there is a change to the legal references only in that. Policy 2250, access to district public records, no changes. Policy 370, succession of authority, no changes have been made to that. And that's for the superintendent principals, just short-term leaves, not the long-term succession piece. Policy 440, incurring debt, no changes, but that was part of the 5-year review. Policy 445, insufficient funds, checks and debit recovery. This policy is part of that 5-year, but minor language changes that were a part of that. More clarifying language than anything else. Policy 455, use of credit and procurement cards. Again, no changes, part of the 5-year. Policy 460, purchases and contracts. This one again has that EHR in it, that employment history review that we put within this. Policy 4100, insurance management. Again, cleanup language. It was as basic as removing certified and putting in licensed.
Real quick, Paul, and I apologize if you already covered this. What level do we do of an EHR review? Right? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
that was new this year within our HR, and every employee coming through here must have that, and districts must require that has been done in the past for employees coming to our district. So it's a fairly extensive review around the sexual misconduct, those areas. So we've actually working, Marcy and her team are working with a different organization to make sure that we have all of that in place, because it can be really time consuming. So we're working with a different agency to make sure that all of those are checked. And
so when we actually do that, I'm assuming that this is a request that goes to the previous district or wherever, right?
Correct.
Is there any standard around what they're providing? Are there any disclosure rules? Because again, I know other states have employment law that, there are a number of protections in place for employees about disclosing work history, disclosing background, other stuff.
Everything that they've listed in that law, they have to disclose to us around that sexual misconduct in other areas, but they must disclose those if they've found them within their employment history. Yeah.
Okay.
That was a significant change that went into effect this year. Good questions. Anything else on that?
No, that was because again, I know we've done some admonishment of some teachers, right, recently. Mm-hmm. And that's something that, again, like obviously hiring practice coming in, but I don't know if, and maybe I'll hold my other piece.
But you'll see that through a number of, from board member to any of our hiring practices or any contract work that we're doing. You'll also see that new language within these policies. Good questions. I think I was on, it's going so fast there. 4120. Yep. Okay. 4120. Again, this was part of the 5-year review. Legal reference changes were made. Policy 530, the hiring process and criteria. Again, you'll highlight the EHR there, the employment hire reference for this policy. Applicants who will have direct contact with children or students. Policy 570, religious holidays, no changes. Policy 590, abused and neglected children reporting. This policy has been updated, requiring districts to develop procedures to notify the parents, guardians of students with whom a district employee, agent, or contractor is alleged to have engaged in sexual misconduct. In addition, this policy now requires superintendents to notify the state superintendent of education and applicable regional superintendents when there is a reasonable cause believed in the license holder's commitment of that piece. Policy 5110, recognition for services, no changes, but through the review. Policy 5125, personal technology and social media usage and conduct. The revised language in this policy permits the state superintendent of education to suspend or revoke any license, endorsement, or approval for sexual misconduct. Policy.
On
Oh,
that
go for it.
one, is that in relation to anything that they might post? Right,
Correct.
so if a parent spots something on like a TikTok for a district employee and brings it to our attention, that could then, lead to the suspension or otherwise.
Absolutely. It's their personal technology, and they literally list, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, any of the social media outlets that they're posting on their personal site.
Okay.
That's why we highly encourage our employees who do use social media to work through the district on district approved, so that people are covered, and we have that ability to do that, and we have a number of people who do that.
Does that go through the communications team?
It does.
Okay.
Yeah. Scott Harvey and the team works with them
Okay.
to develop a district one. So it'll just have like a D303, just make one up for wrestling or something along
Right.
those lines.
And anything that goes, I'm assuming that he has a documented approval process. And so employees are the teams, the teachers and stuff like that, are they familiar with like the submission process and everything like that?
Yeah, we try to make sure that our employees, especially in this area, because I think a number of educators really do want to engage, but we really try to make sure they're educated on some of the downside of it. There's a lot of plus side in the communication,
Right.
but there's also a lot of downside. So we really want to make sure that our educators know. And then the president of the Teachers Association also does a really nice job of making sure her members are well aware.
Along those lines, does Scott or, again, Jen Adams from a union perspective, are they reviewing any hashtags or other things that might be applicable to our district?
I would need to, I'll ask Scott that if there's, if they have a criteria for the hashtag.
Yeah,
My gut would be no, that, but I'll check though.
Yeah, because the reason I bring that up is because previously parents have reached out to me and said, hey, check this hashtag, like there's something there, or, whatever. And again, a lot of it is mostly student content, right? Which again, First Amendment, right? But again, teachers or other things potentially using that. So
Yeah, it really is under our guidance and our expectation of our staff.
and it's a lot of real estate to police.
It is a lot of real estate to police. And again, that's why with the policies, making sure, I think one of the most important things that we do is communicating out to our staff around those new policies that have been updated, but also really hitting on, because it's a boatload of policies, but making sure that we're in partnership with the Teachers Association and our other associations, making sure that they're being notified in timely, and delineating those that are kind of those high flyer, those essential pieces. So our staff do know these well, and they're not caught into a bind. Like I didn't know that. So great question. 5140, solicitation by or from staff, updated, no changes. 5150, personnel records, again, EHR information in there. 5170, copyright, no changes. 5190, teacher qualifications, no changes. Maintaining student discipline, this policy is part of a 5-year review, and then very minor language changes. 5240, suspension, this policy is part of the 5-year, no changes. Student teacher, this policy has been updated, requiring district employees and contractors to undergo, EHR, when they have direct contract with children and students. Policy 5285, drug and alcohol testing for school bus and commercial, been reviewed, no changes. Policy 610, educational philosophy and objectives, no changes under the 5-year review. Teaching about religion, policy 670. This is a 5-year review, no changes. Policy 6130, program for the gifted, 5-year review, no changes. Policy 6135, accelerated placement program, minor language changes in that one. 6140, education of homeless children, 5-year review, minor legal changes have been made to that. Policy 6190, extracurricular and co-curricular activities, 5-year review, but no changes. Policy 6210, instructional materials, 5-year, no changes. Policy 6230, library media program, updated regarding the management of book challenge, library book challenges. Policy 6240, field trip and recreational class trips, reviewed, no changes. Policy 6270, guidance and counseling program, 5-year review, no changes. Policy 7250, student support services, reflects the addition of language around grooming behaviors to align with Aaron's Law 105, ILCS 10-23.13. Policy 7275, orders to forego life-sustaining treatment. This policy is part of a 5-year review, minor language. Policy 7305, student athlete and concussion and head injuries, 5-year review, minor language. Policy 7330, student use of buildings, equal access. This policy is the 5-year review, no changes. Policy 820, community use of facilities, reflects legal references. Policy 825, advertising and distributing materials in schools provided by non-school related entities, 5-year review, no changes. Policy 870, accommodating individuals with disability, 5-year review, no changes. Policy 895, parental involvement, 5-year review, no changes. Policy 8100, relations in other organization and agencies. This policy reflects legal changes. We would recommend that all of these go to the next board meeting under consent.
Quick question for you,
Ask
Paul.
away.
And I think you mentioned this earlier, but when we do the 5-year review and no changes have been made, can we just explain why we're conducting that review and what we're looking for?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, Press, the organization that works with the vast majority of school districts throughout Illinois, their legal team does a 5-year review of all these policies. And what they're really searching for are two big things: any legal changes, any laws that have gone into effect, anything that would have a major impact in these laws. They make those changes, they highlight them for the board, and then any legal references that were omitted in the past or new laws that have come on to review those. So Press does that for us. Their team of lawyers goes through this with a fine-tooth comb, then sends us that information, because it is a lot of legal work, and cross-referencing would not be a job I'd want.
Okay, thanks for the clarity. Any more discussion, board? I think we have some folks online as well, if they can communicate in if they have any questions. I will take that as a no. Okay, and I believe then we put this on the consent agenda, right? And if there's any policies that board members have additional concerns or questions about, that could be pulled. But otherwise, we'll put that on the consent agenda. Will that be for the August 7th meeting then? Okay, consent agenda, August 7th. Without further discussion, I believe that brings us to item 3, 3A, future agenda items. Anything on the docket, Paul?
We will be bringing forward a couple of individual policies that we will first start with the two co-chairs. We'll have some conversations there, and then we'll bring those forward to our next policy meeting. So conversations around changes to expenditures, and then we will get the committee co-chairs their thoughts on that, and then we'll bring it to the full policy committee at the next meeting. Ms. Barsana, are there any other press? We've cleaned We've done a good job of cleaning. Okay, so yeah, that will be it.
All right, well, that takes us to item 3B, adjournment at 4:47 PM. Thanks, everyone.
All right, I'd like to call to order the Business Services Committee meeting for Community Unit School District 303 at 5:30 here. And taking us to item 1B, citizens' comments. I have the report that we have no citizens' comments for today, so that brings us immediately to item number 2 for discussion. And 2A is the Mid-Valley June financial report.
So let's see, Mid-Valley continues to report that revenue is trending higher than the prior year. And as we priorly stated, it's due to receiving more ALOP and ESSER funds than anticipated. They have also received some Medicaid fee-for-service funds this year and EBF funds that will also be distributed to the district. Expenditures include all summer payroll and extended school year expenses and are very close to the budgeted amounts. There will be some possible audit adjustments from their year-end audit.
Seeing no questions or comments from the rest of the board, I'll move to item 2B, the CUSD 303 financial report for June.
So the district revenue continues to trend very close to the prior year as a percent of budget. The district has received the 4th and final categorical payment from the state for the year. There will be some additional federal revenue that was vouchered in July, and we're hoping and expecting it to be received in the coming weeks. Expenditures are trending slightly ahead of the prior year at this time, and there are no areas of concern. I do want to point out that though this is the June financial report, it is not the final year-end report. Since the district follows a modified accrual accounting, we have some transactions both on the revenue and expense sides that will be paid or received in July and August that will be applied to the year ended June 30th. An example would be we have numerous invoices that have been dated and paid in July that are for product or services that were performed prior to July 1st. And all those are considered 22-23 expenditures. The same pattern is true for revenue, with the federal revenue as an example that I already mentioned. We will be sharing a nearly final report to update the board on these interim transactions as we complete the July and August accrual. And the district audit is scheduled to begin early September.
Thank you. Seeing no questions, I'll move us to item 2C, the fiscal year 2024 D303 final draft budget.
All right, I'll wait for the presentation to come up. Perfect. Okay, so in May, we talked about budget draft 1. So this is budget draft 2, or what is commonly referred to as the tentative budget for fiscal year 24. So in May, we started talking about the basics of school finance. Tonight, we're going to do season 1, episode 2 of basics of school finance. So in May, we talked about the types of funds, details and examples of the operating funds and interfund transfers. And tonight, I thought it would be beneficial if we went in a little bit more detail with revenue sources that we have at the school district. So there are 3 primary sources of revenue that we record on the school district here at the school district. Local revenue, which would be property taxes, corporate personal property replacement taxes, and other local revenues. State revenues, which would be evidence-based funding and other categorical grants, and then federal revenues. So this slide shows a comparison of the sources of revenues from the United States, Illinois as a whole, and then CUSD 303. So as you can see, as you're looking across the graphs, the percentage of local revenue increases dramatically as you start to move across. And you may be surprised that Illinois isn't a little bit higher than 53%, because it's really not that much higher in total than the entirety of the United States. And that primarily is because Central and Southern Illinois doesn't receive nearly the property tax revenue that we receive in Northern Illinois. So that's balancing that out in the Illinois graph. And that's why you see District 303 at 90%, 90.5% local revenue. So our primary source of local revenue is property taxes. Property taxes in Illinois are governed by the Truth and Taxation Law, School Code, the Property Tax Code, and then the Property Tax Extension Limitation Law, or PTEL. All of these determine the amount of funds available for use by each specific fund, such as education and O&M. And there are several regulations that we have to follow as we're developing the property tax levy each year. Thank you, Dave. So one of the primary drivers of the property tax levy each year is CPI, Consumer Price Index. This graphical illustration is historical CPI going back to 2013, and you can see that it normally hovers somewhere between, in most years, between 1% and 3%. The last 2 years of CPI have been outrageous, very, very high. 7% in 2022 and then 6.5% in 2023. The good news is, as we've watched the trends here in calendar year 23, we've seen a pretty dramatic decrease in CPI month over month. So we're hoping that when we come to the end of this calendar year, we're going to see a significant decrease from the 2 years that we're showing at the tail end here. So the CPI.
Mr. Attaway, before you go on to that, can we talk a little bit more about the CPI? And
Absolutely.
how it impacts D303's revenue? I know you're going to cover that a little bit in the next slide, but also how it impacts D303's costs.
Yeah, absolutely. So just as Consumer Price Index would influence any residential homeowners or any single person's expenses, same goes for the school district. Consumer Price Index is, you know, a barometer of where the economy is and what the cost of goods are and how that's trending up. We incur those same additional expenses that any household would. So the cost of food has been going up drastically, and we have the responsibility to feed 12,000 students every day. So that is a huge cost on our budget. Same with maintaining our facilities. So we've seen, and it's fitting that I have Amanda and Dan sitting at the table with me, because we've seen the cost of construction go through the roof over the past few years, with a lot of the bids that we would anticipate to come in at a certain level coming in 50% higher, if not more. So we've been experiencing significantly increased costs from CPI, even beyond what our increases in revenue would allow us to maintain. So we've had to tighten up our budget in certain areas just to make sure that we can make ends meet.
Thank you for that.
So when we're thinking about CPI, it can be a little difficult when we're putting together the budget, because the budget actually has 2 different levies in it. So this budget year will have the 2022 levy at 5%, and then the 2023 levy, which hasn't occurred yet, at 5%, for a total revenue of estimated revenue of about 184 million in property taxes. That can make things a little bit more challenging as we're putting together the budget, because we're counting half of the primary source of revenue off of a levy that hasn't even been submitted yet for board approval. So it can be a little bit difficult to estimate. We haven't gotten numbers back from the county yet, where we include a lot of assumptions in our budget when we're creating the property tax levy. Corporate personal property replacement tax is another source of local revenue. So CPPRT was created in the late 1970s when Illinois repealed the personal property tax. The allocation mechanism has remained the same since it was created in the 1970s. So CPPRT revenues are unrestricted. We can use those funds for any lawful purpose. And for some districts, CPPRT is a large line item. For others, it's a little bit smaller, and it really depends on the makeup of the community in the 1970s. So because that funding mechanism hasn't changed, we're counting on the community makeup from 50 years ago to determine how these dollars are allocated. Now, the amount of money has gone up, but the actual mechanism has not changed since the 1970s. And then the other local revenue, that primary sources of local revenue that we have in our budget are student fees, investment income, and then field trip activity, athletic fees, just the normal operating fees. Of these, investment income is one of the highest. It's been very, very low in the past few years, but we're now seeing that start to trend up pretty rapidly. State funding has changed quite a bit over the last 10 years. So 2017 and prior, we had general state aid, several special education categorical grants, bilingual education grants. And then in 2018, all of those were consolidated into the evidence-based funding model. So they took those 5 grants that existed very separately and rolled those all into EBF in 2018. Now, we do still have several categorical grants that exist outside of EBF. So there are a few special education grants, there are the transportation grants that we have, and then early childhood or preschool for all. So those still exist outside of EBF, but the remainder of the state funding all was rolled into the EBF funding model going forward.
Is there any legislation that we should be aware of or lobbying for associated with grants? We talked a lot in a couple of meetings past around ALOP and that funding. And then we know there's been a lot of conversation about all-day kindergarten. Are there other sources of revenue approaching or addressing all-day kindergarten or anything like ALOP that we should be looking at, either from a legislation pending standpoint that we should be calling our representatives about, or in any other way?
Not that has really hit the radar quite yet. I know that all-day kindergarten has been a big topic at the state legislature, and we need to see how that's going to process through still. Other than that, the other big one that we see sometimes would be construction grants that go through. Those come very infrequently, and they are large dollar amounts typically when they come through, but they typically end up going to school districts that show a little bit more need than our school district. So we likely would not be eligible for the majority of some of those grants that would come through. But it definitely is something that we need to keep our eye on as new grants emerge. So EBF is the primary source of state funding that we receive. The EBF model has several different steps in its calculation when determining our allocation. So EBF really looks at individual school districts and uses a formula of almost 30 different factors to figure out how much providing a high quality education should cost at that district, given district demographics, location, and whatnot. Then they look at how well funded is that district. So how close can they actually come to achieving that dollar amount that was in the calculation. That's considered the local capacity. So that's what the district is able to supply on their own right now. Beyond that, the state will take that gap and they will use that to tier school districts and then assign and allocate dollars, based on the tiers. So District 303 is tier 4. We're over 100% adequacy right now. So we receive very little and additional funding with EBF each year. But you do have several school districts that exist in tier 1 that receive a large portion of money each year. And the goal is eventually all districts will be close to 100% funded with additional state funding. And then the last source of revenue that we have is federal funding. So these are typically restricted grants or reimbursement programs. So National School Lunch Program, which is a direct reimbursement of our lunches at K-8. The Every Student Succeeds Act, which is your Title I, Title II grants, and then special education or IDEA. Are there any questions about revenue before I move on? Okay. So moving into the fiscal year 2024 budget, just as a reminder, our budget cycle, although we talk about it a very specific part of the year, the budget cycle is really 12 months. It starts in October when we're talking about the tax levy and working on our 5-year projections. Then in February, we move into the development phase where we're preparing our cost center budgets, working with principals on their building budgets, and then consolidating and reviewing draft 1 with the Business Services Committee. And right now we're sitting in that refine and approve phase. So we're going through committee review of the tentative budget right now, and then anticipating board approval in September. So as I just mentioned, in May, we reviewed draft 1 with the Business Services Committee. Tonight, we're reviewing the final draft budget. Then in August, we're asking the board to establish the public hearing, and we will publish the budget hearing notice. And then in September, we'll hold the public hearing at the regular board meeting and move to adopt the budget. So significant changes between draft one and draft two. On the revenue side, there were three primary changes between the drafts. So on the revenue side, we included an increase to corporate personal property replacement tax projections of about 1.1 million. And then we increased our investment income projections by just over 1.1 million. On the expense side, we were able to finalize the projected personnel expenses. If you'll remember when we talked about this in May, we did not have 3 approved labor contracts. Now we do, so we were able to rerun all of the personnel numbers. And that was an increase to the expense side of about 1.2 million.
Does that include, I know we had some overages for contractor for transportation stuff. Does that include like a phasing out of that? Because we're still going to have some contractor stuff next year as well.
It does. So the transportation fund is budgeted in such a way that if those happen to fall to salaries, they can fall to salaries. If they happen to need to be contracted out, that's available as well.
So if I have this rightly, we, pardon the coarseness of the words, we found 2.2 million in additional revenue dollars, and we increased or found 1.2 in additional costs.
Correct.
And so our net is net $1 million on the positive side of the ledger. Is that about right?
Yep.
Thanks.
So these are the updated operating budget revenue allocations. So as we discussed most of the time, and as we talked a little bit about earlier, property taxes make up the vast majority of our revenue at just under 84%. State revenue is just a little bit behind at 7.1%. And then there's other local revenue at 6.7 and federal at 2.4. So this is a comparison of revenue by fund from fiscal year 23 budget to the fiscal year 24 budget. So we're looking at roughly an $8.5 million increase in revenue between fiscal year 23 and fiscal year 24. And that's spread throughout all of the funds. On the expenditure side, this slide shows the percentages of the operating budget for expenditures. As is with most school districts in Illinois, salaries and benefits make up the vast majority of the expense side. We are a people business. So salaries and benefits make up about 78% of the expenditure budget. And then this slide shows the breakdown, similar to revenue, of expenditures from fiscal year 23 to fiscal year 24 by fund. And if you'll notice, there are several funds that we either did not increase. In some cases, we decreased expenses. There were only a few funds that we really increased expenses, and that was part of a budget tightening that we went through this spring in order to balance the budget. So this slide shows the surplus and deficits for all funds. We're showing 3 columns, one for the fiscal year 23 budget, one for the fiscal year 24 draft 1, and one for fiscal year 24 draft 2. So from draft 1 to draft 2, all funds, there was a $546,000 surplus in draft 1. There's about a $1.5 million surplus in draft 2 across all funds. This slide shows just the operating funds. So same structure. We went from about a $2.8 million surplus in draft 1 to about a $4.1 million surplus in draft 2. The only thing that I will note is in this table, the $3 million transfer to Fund 60 is not reflected here. So that $4.1 million surplus is not nearly as high in reality as it appears on this chart, because we needed to have an additional $3 million sitting in O&M to be able to transfer out to capital projects. And then next steps on the fiscal year 24 budget. So in August, we're going to ask the board to establish the public hearing date for September. We'll publish the public hearing notice and we'll place the budget on display for 30 days. And then in September, we'll hold the public hearing and ask the board to adopt the fiscal year 24 budget before the end of September. Are there any questions on the budget?
Does this include an additional levy on taxpayers? Or is this based on the previous levy?
This is anticipating the levy that would come this December. And the levy is at the same level as it was last year.
So from a modeling standpoint, you've got a levy pegged to 5% increase, which is the maximum allowable
Correct.
in order to look at its revenue potential on this year. Is that
Correct.
about right?
Correct.
Sorry, I did have one more. And it also doesn't include anything that we've talked about from a facilities or, raising additional. That when that happens, we amend the budget, then what's the process for that?
So if we need to amend the budget, that follows a very similar process to the regular budget that'll come in the spring. Normally, we would start that process in April, and then the board would approve the amended budget by the end of June. It's likely that most of the construction expenses that are associated with the board meeting from last week would fall into fiscal year 25. So there may be a chance that we would not need to amend the budget for this year. We would just need to incorporate all of those additional expenses into the next fiscal year's budget.
Does the proposed tax levy change based off of the surplus funds? Like, so for example, the 2 million plus funds that we found, how does that impact the ask of the community?
That is, so it's not an automatic trigger. That would be something that the board would consider when we were looking at the tax levy at the end of the year. I would not, on our size budget, I would not necessarily consider a $2 million surplus to be a large surplus, just because of the size of the budget and how that can fluctuate from year to year. But that is something that we can discuss as we're looking at the tax levy in November.
Thank you.
But we'll also have seen by then 6 months worth of expenditures against the budget, and we'll
Correct.
see whether we're trending ahead or behind.
Right.
Without additional questions, I think we can move to the Mid-Valley final draft budget.
So the Mid-Valley tentative budget has been included in your board packet. If you have any questions on that budget, that was put together by Mid-Valley, but feel free to send me any questions that you have or relay those questions to me now, and I'll be happy to pass those along to Mid-Valley.
Doesn't look like we have any presently. Thanks. That brings us to the budget on display and scheduling the public hearing, item E.
So the next two agenda items, E and F, are the same for District 303 and Mid-Valley. So this would be the next step that I discussed in the District 303 presentation. So authorizing administration to put the budget on display for 30 days and then schedule the public hearing for the regular board meeting in September.
Is that on our agenda for the board meeting today? Or does the authorization come without a vote?
That authorization would come at the August board meeting.
Great. I think that brings us to item G, unless there are questions about when we'll vote on the public hearing schedule. No, seeing no questions, that brings us to G, long range capital improvement plan.
So District 303 has been working towards a facilities master plan to ensure the long-term functionality of our buildings and the educational support systems within. This plan establishes a framework for our structural maintenance, improvements, and growth, and it needs to be responsive to our organization's current and projected needs. This plan outlined urgent and high priority stages to achieve our goals, and staff has already taken some of those initial steps towards addressing some of the urgent items such as space and boundaries. So the next step is included out for our groundwork is establishing a capital improvement plan to address the long-term planning needs for high need capital maintenance projects. So in the first step of doing that was to complete a facility assessment to identify our current and projected maintenance and replacement needs. This assessment was recently completed by Wold Architects. The assessment outlined the major maintenance, modifications, and replacement needed in our building and our systems and components over the next 10 plus years. Over $213 million in capital expenditures were identified during this process. In combination with some additional access control and security improvements, staff is in the process of prioritizing these findings, utilizing the board-approved guiding principles, the component life cycles, utilization information of our systems, and the impact on the available funding. A 10-year capital improvement plan is being drafted to begin addressing the urgent and high priority needs of the district facilities. To give a little more definition to these urgent and high priority needs, it should be noted that most of what will be in this 10-year plan is replacement, not enhancement. as an exercise that we completed to understand what was presented in this assessment, staff prioritized and looked at these items in the assessment and how they aligned with the board approved guiding principles for our facilities. And as of right now, 60% of this entire assessment aligns with component number 5, our guiding principle number 5, which is replace end of life infrastructure. These items include roof replacements, parking lot maintenance and replacement, mechanical system replacements, including air handlers, rooftop units, boilers, chillers, water heaters, and that such. We have fire alarm systems in need of replacements and other security and safety related replacements. These items are a necessity to maintain safe and secure buildings for our educational and community needs. It should also be noted that not everything in the assessment needs to be addressed in the next 10 years, but staff is currently under that process of evaluating all these items identified to really understand what is critical for our facilities and our district for the next 10 years. It also should be noted that staff is also assessing the assessment, if you will, looking at different alternate options for completing this work. Some examples might be for our buildings that are serviced by ComEd. Are there different ComEd incentive programs that the district can take advantage of to get, grants or other funding to replace LED fixtures, sensors, things like that? Another example would be, could we look at coating a roof to extend its life in lieu of replacement? So these are things that staff continue to look at and prioritize over this next month before we bring you a draft plan in August. So with that said, this capital improvement plan will set the foundation to ensure the adequate resources are available to address the continued maintenance for our buildings. The plan will have to remain adaptable and responsive to the needs of our district, and staff will revisit the plan with the board to allow for reprioritization as needed.
In that, you mentioned the key cards. I know that's something, Paul, that we've previously asked to look at. Key cards aren't included in this number right now, correct?
That's
there.
Correct.
Okay, got it. So this is the 212, 213 is still in flux. Okay. We're talking about the budget, right? And so one of the questions that I have, as a steward of the taxpayers' money is, we've historically kept a fairly low maintenance, capital improvements number, $2 to $3 million, $3 million annually. What does the increase look like, or what does a proper capital budget look like for a district of our size?
Well, for a district of our size, what we're currently doing is, as I mentioned, looking at the 10-year plan and assessing what is really needed. And at this time, the traditional $3 million that has been allocated in our capital budget is not going to be adequate to sustain the buildings as needed for our operation. So in comparison to other communities and for a district of our size at this point, I don't have that data, but I'm happy to bring that forward for next month, understand that a little bit more.
I would venture to guess that for a district our size, we would want to hover somewhere between 8 and 10 million a year in order to stay just at zero.
So why was spending historically low over that time period? Are we now kind of paying for things that may have been kicked down the road a little bit?
Yeah, I can't necessarily speak to why that model was in place. It seems like that's been the case for years and years. There are potentially some items now that are bubbling up that that maybe could have been addressed in years prior. But if the money wasn't available, if it wasn't allocated, then I can tell you that the district with the money that was allocated did a great job at keeping up, but there probably should have been a little bit more money allocated to take care of some of these things along the way.
It also should be noted that standard life cycles of a lot of these larger cost components, such as roof, mechanical systems, and things of that nature, are typically between 20 and 30 years. And just because of the sheer age of some of our facilities that are aligning with that, it's not necessarily deferred maintenance, but it's just at that time in the life cycle for those facilities.
When we Oh, sorry.
I was just going to piggyback real briefly off that. So would we anticipate then, given that some of these are likely critical needs, would we anticipate that a large percentage of that 213 million would be upfront? Would we be seeing a huge upfront cost and then trying to allocate those funds accordingly over the next 7-8 years? What does that look like? Or have we not gotten to that?
I'm not sure we've gotten to that point. That's what we're planning on bringing back to the board next month, where we'll actually have this broken out in year bands that we can discuss. That's something, with Amanda being here for 3 weeks, we want to give her the opportunity to learn our buildings and really start to look at things with a critical eye and assess how urgent some of these needs actually are. So we're planning on bringing that back to the board in August.
I think for that report in August, I think it would be very helpful for the board. And I'll speak for myself, right? If seeing what's end of life, right? And then also there are certain things on here, right? So again, electrical systems is a pretty large line item, almost 20%, right? Obviously the electrical needs of our schools have changed, since they were made, right? So giving a little bit of color around and especially potentially in the bands, some timing around when those can be addressed, from a long-term thought out process.
Yeah, there are, so as I mentioned, not all the items identified in the assessment will be in the 10-year plan. And for electrical, for example, some of the major things that we saw in that category are occupancy sensors, LED replacements or retrofits, clock and speaker systems, some additional exterior lighting for safety and security. So not all of those components are critical paths for our facility. They will be great to explore in future years, but they probably will not be included specifically in our 5 years or maybe not even 10 years, depending on, as we finish this assessment of all these needs. But so of that 213 million, if it is not allocated or recommended to be addressed within the next 10 years, we will also provide that, let you know what that is, so that if board does want to provide that input or we need to shuffle things around based on priorities, we have that ability.
I appreciate the examples that you shared, because one of the figures you used was 60% of the 200 plus is replacing end of life, which begs the question, what's the other 40? And I just heard some of the examples of that, which would be site specific enhancements for safety and a couple of other issues. So I'll look forward to seeing the breakdown that Mr. Lentz described and better understanding that 40%. And I look forward to that next bit.
Quick question, and when you mentioned retrofits, and we're talking about things there where we're hoping to reduce operating costs for the future. So do we have any sort of an idea of what kind of savings we'd get in operating costs and what the payout would ultimately be?
Sure, not at this time in terms of dollars for this specific type of projects. As again, staff is really going to utilize those guiding principles that was approved by the board as well. And, end of life replacement was high in that list, where operational costs is number, 10 or 11 or so. So we're going to continue to rank and prioritize those projects. And when the projects such as retrofits come to light, we'll definitely explore what those type of cost savings would provide to our district.
Are any of the, so we have the line or the item for interior, right? Are any of the ADA updates that have been identified by CAC and the board previously included in this plan currently? Okay.
You want to put voice to that and say my shaking my head.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul.
No, there are none of the larger scale ADA improvements identified in this assessment. There were some site specific, classroom specific items identified. And I'd like to hand it over maybe to Dan to provide a little bit of information about the assessment and what was captured.
Yeah, so on the ADA front, some of the bigger swing things that the Educational Facility Planning Committee identified would not be level changes in buildings and things like that. It'd be more, is there a suitable bathroom that presents ADA compliance? So those are the things, the smaller pieces that get you just that baseline of ADA acceptance at a building, but not full compliance. We're more focused on at that committee level.
Well, because I know that was one of the things for the board, right, as a strategic priority from a planning, was ADA compliance throughout the district too. is it possible in the August breakdown to get some of those items put in here? Or at least the minor ones? And then if there are some of the larger items, I know we're going to be addressing, obviously, with the Lincoln work, right? We're going to be addressing two pretty significant ADA items in that work. But if we could potentially call out a couple of the other ones that are there. I know we have some very specific ones that we've previously costed out and put there. I wouldn't want to potentially put it into this bucket, but I'd certainly like to be able to see it overall for the board to be able to take a look at it. Because again, it was identified as a strategic priority for the community, and figuring out how we address that. If it makes a larger question about a building that we have to make a bunch of changes to, for example.
Yeah, no, I appreciate Mr. Lenz putting it into a separate bucket, but allowing the board to see that next to the 10-year, I think would make a lot of sense for the board to see that bigger picture of ADA over here, because when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about Wild Rose and Davis specifically. There's some, as Dan said, there's some specific ADA issues throughout our district, but they're smaller in size and scope compared to a Wild Rose or a Davis. But we can have that for you outside of the current 10-year.
Yeah, and again, the idea being is that as we're looking at our fleet, right, and assessing these buildings, if we've seen what we have to do in some of these buildings, what and where are those challenges, right? That's, again, I want to look at it holistically so we get a good picture of it.
In some ways, if I heard you rightly, Mr. Lentz, it's all other things being equal. If we were only going to address ADA compliance, what would that list of projects look like? And maybe what would the price tag or the range of price look like? Is that about right?
Exactly, Mr. Wagner.
Probably one more clarifying for that as I look over to Dan. Is that possible to do for that August meeting? I guess I was agreeing to it, but I'm not going to be doing the work. My cabinet is pretty used to that.
I think we can give a sense of what that looks like. When we're talking about Davis and Wild, those are larger ticket explorations that there's probably more ways than one to get there. And it might have a lot to do with, are there other issues at the building that we're trying to solve in concert with that?
Seeing no other questions. Mr. Lynch, you have another?
The only other one that I had, I want to, I think I know the answer for this, but I like to put it out there. As we're looking at, let's say, the upgrades for electrical and everything else, we always have a mind for a cost reduction. I think the question was asked, right? So can we talk a little bit about, we don't go for LEED certification or anything like that, but we always, that's kind of a foundational principle, right?
Yeah, and electrical is the perfect example, because there are plenty of incentive programs out there, either through ComEd or through service providers, where they will actually fund the majority of these projects because it puts less strain on their system. So very often, a lot of the examples that Amanda gave for occupancy sensors and LED lights, a lot of those can be funded where the majority of it comes from ComEd or from a service provider. And we just have to agree to let them come in and do that in our building. So not only will we see a reduction in our expense on the front, but we'll also see operating cost reduction on the back end.
There was actually an email that came in, I want to say this week, maybe today, from ComEd on that. Have we initiated that process to have them come and do an assessment of all of our buildings?
So we're not working directly with ComEd, but we've actually engaged with Siemens to come in, and they're currently working on a facility assessment for all of our buildings. They're going to put together a list of things that they believe that they can do to make our buildings more energy efficient, what the cost savings would be, operating cost savings would be, what they're able to do with an incentive on the front end for it. So we're anticipating that that'll come over the next few months, but we've just started that process with them now.
Okay. And is there any benefit to also having ComEd do the free, or is that
It's the same program.
Oh, it's the same program.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Well, seeing no other questions, thanks for the discussion on the long-range capital improvement plan. We look forward to the next chapter. And that brings us to item H, the I love the way it's phrased, the annual approval of hazardous bus routes.
Before I launch into this, Dan, you are free to not sit at the table anymore if you don't want to. Yeah. So this is an annual item that we bring to the board. Every year, according to school code, the school board needs to approve the hazardous bus routes for the next year. Those are routes existing within 1.5 miles of the child's school, where conditions are such that walking constitutes a serious hazard to pupils due to vehicular traffic. So we have no changes to the hazardous routes that existed last year. So we're just asking the board to approve the same hazardous routes.
I think we move that for the consent agenda, and I'll make the request on behalf of the board, stepping out on a ledge here, that in the future, we talk about these as the hazardous walking routes. It's the bus routes aren't hazardous. It's the walking routes that are hazardous, and we're trying to avoid those.
I'll make note of that.
Thank you. That brings us to item I, the ATI athletic training contract amendment.
So we are currently entering the final year of our contract with ATI. ATI right now provides all the physical therapy and trainer services for our sports teams at East and North. ATI approached us asking for an amendment to the contract for the final year that increases the cost of their trainers. So right now, our current agreement is $46,000 per school, or an annual total of $92,000 between the two schools. Due to labor cost increases, ATI they're losing money every single year. So they're really just trying to get a little bit of that back. And actually what they've proposed doesn't get them back to even. They have proposed increasing the annual cost per school up to $100,000 for $200,000 total. So this is a large increase. It's actually lower than several other districts that work with ATI have received. My recommendation would be that we approve this for this final year of the contract, that ensures that our services are still offered to the students who participate in our athletic programs. And then we take this next year to do an evaluation of what other ways we can provide athletic training services to our students at both of the high schools.
So I think you indicated this was largely due to their staffing costs, right? So did they give a breakdown of how their staffing costs have doubled?
They have not. They didn't give me that specific breakdown, but I can request that.
I think that would be great to see.
Without further objection or conversation, I'd suggest that we put this on the consent agenda for the next meeting. And that brings us to the intergovernmental agreement for school resource officers, item J.
So our current SRO agreement with the city of St. Charles for the middle and high schools just recently expired. We did negotiate a new SRO agreement with the city. There are no substantial revisions to this SRO agreement. Most of the changes were just to align with laws that are now in effect that were not in place when the original agreement came about. The proposed term is for 3 years, so running from July 1st, 23 to June 30th, 26. The district's attorney has reviewed the agreement and is suggesting no additional changes.
Without seeing questions, I would suggest that we add that to the consent agenda for the next board meeting, which brings us to item K, the Thompson Turf Intergovernmental Agreement.
So District 303 actually has several IGAs with St. Charles Park District. One of them is for use of the Thompson Turf Field. That's been in place since 2018. And since 2018, I think we're on revision 3 of that, amendment 3 of that agreement. So we talked with Park District and actually negotiated a new IGA that consolidates all of the amendments into a single agreement. It also restructures how the district is compensated by Park District for use of the fields. For some reason, the Thompson Turf was on a different compensation schedule than the remaining facilities that Park District uses. So we just aligned the compensation for the Thompson Turf Fields with the remainder of the facilities that Park District uses to match that language.
Will that have a positive or a negative impact on the revenue that it generates?
It may actually have a positive impact. Right now, a Park District is obligated to pay us money that they are not making on the Thompson Turf. So there have been some difficulties with payments, which is part of the reason why some of those amendments were put into place. This honestly, with it aligning with the other compensation structures, basically Park District does well financially, the district will do well financially on the use of that field.
I like that they're aligned. That's positive from my point of view. Looking for other questions. If I see none, then I'll suggest that intergovernmental agreement also is added to the consent agenda in the next meeting. And that brings us to item L, the purchase of operations F-350 trucks.
So the facilities department currently has 32 vehicles, including pickup trucks, vans, cube trucks, and other dump trucks. This is in addition to the trailers, lifts, and other ground-related equipment used by the team. In coordination with transportation, staff evaluates the needs for replacement of our vehicles on a variety of factors, including age, mileage, quantity and magnitude of repairs needed, and overall condition of the body. Industry standards point towards replacement of our vehicles at around the 10-year mark, and District 303's institutional experience points towards a similar timeframe, roughly between in a deal replacement between 10 to 13 years. It has been 3 years since the department has replaced any of these 32 vehicles, and it has been determined that there are 3 that are ready for replacement due to those previous mentioned factors. All 3 of these are pickup trucks for our grounds team, and they do require the additional snow plowing packages needed for the winter operations. At this time, we have no backup trucks with the snow plowing equipment. We're proposing to purchase 3 F-350s through the state of Illinois' joint purchasing master contract. One of these 3 trucks was previously approved for replacement by the board last fiscal year. However, authorizations weren't approved in time to meet the small ordering window that was allocated through this contract each year. So last year, the proposed purchase price with all the required options was $78,517 per truck. The 2023 pricing has not been released yet, but staff is recommending the board authorize administration to move forward with the purchase with a not to exceed price of $90,000 per truck, or a total of $270,000. Staff is requesting this advance approval in efforts of not missing the next window for the opportunity to order through this contract, but it is anticipated that this window will open up within the next few months. If approved, the truck will be ordered through Landmark Ford using the state contract.
So is the additional 12,000 just an estimate of what we think the year-over-year cost increases will be
Yes.
per truck?
Correct.
Okay, and then when is that window typically? I think you said it would be opening up in the next few months. When
Yeah.
is it and how long is that window?
I don't have that exact answer. I know our transportation group has been checking on a weekly basis with the state contract to see when that time frame is opening up, but don't have the exact answer at this time.
This is, we've used this previously in this district, and I've also used the state contract in other districts where I've been. We really want to be on the front end of that contract window, because eventually Landmark Ford is going to become overwhelmed with orders and they will just stop taking orders, which is what happened to us last year, where we were towards the middle to tail end of the contract window and they just stopped taking orders because they received too many to be able to fulfill. So we're asking for this approval upfront. We're asking for a not to exceed dollar amount, just to make sure we can get in on the front end of the contract and make sure that our order is actually fulfilled this year.
And last quick question, is Landmark the only dealership then that can fulfill this order?
They are. So the state contract is very similar to what we do with bids. So the state will put out a bid. There will be a single vendor that wins that bid, and then any other government agency in Illinois is able to purchase off of that contract. So they were the successful bidder for that bid. So they're the only ones that are able to do that if we buy through the state contract.
Thanks for the clarity.
Have we looked at what it would be outside the state contract, or is it that much more favorable? I know that there's starting to be a bit of an inventory on trucks.
Yeah, it's starting. Typically, the state contract is in line with or a little bit better than what we would be able to do individually, just because Landmark knows that they're going to receive orders for thousands of vehicles off of this. So they're able to get their margins really, really tight. We haven't explored, we would need to go through a full bid process. In order to do that, they would take a few months. And that's something that we're not opposed to doing, especially if we miss the contract window again this year, that we would just bid on our own. But typically the state contract prices, from what I've seen, are fairly competitive with what we were able to get on our own.
And
I'm sorry. I
Any-
was just gonna ask related to that real quickly. Is there a process, you know, how we do like a request for proposal often with other organizations? Is there something like that that we can do for automobile procurement?
There is, so we would go through a normal competitive bid similar to what we would do for construction. So we would put together our own bid spec. We would issue that, we would send it to several dealers in the area. They would be able to submit bids to us that we would open and then bring to the board. So that definitely is an option if we wanted to do that. It's a long process to go through, but it's definitely available to us.
Thank you very much.
Oh, how many more vehicles do we have anticipated coming up in the next several years, right? I know that these are the first three, right, that are end of life. But what does the schedule look like for us the next couple of years here, if we were to consider a bit, bidding out?
Great question. I'm currently in the process of evaluating all of the facility or all of the vehicles that we have in our inventory. But just as a quick analysis, we have 32 vehicles and that doesn't include our trailers and other ground equipment and things like that. And so if we're averaging between 10 and 13 years each, we really should be looking at 2 to 3 per year to stay on top of those life cycles.
The expense associated with this is already encapsulated in the draft budget.
That is correct.
Thank you. We can put this on the agenda for action. If folks would like to have a further discussion about it, I think it's appropriate for us to have it on the for action list for the board meeting. Which I think brings us to the college board quote. Item M.
So this is related to the SAT suite of assessments that D303 administers to all 9th through 11th grade, 11th graders and the middle school students that are participating in programs such as Avid and Infinity. These assessments provide students, parents, and staff with important information. The district uses the information to help evaluate curriculum and programs. So this is a renewal of the SAT suite of assessments for a grand total of $39,975.50.
Given the importance for that of our use of that data for so many benchmarks. My personal opinion is we ought to put it on the consent agenda. Seeing no other comments, I would offer item N, the contract for enrollment and boundaries analysis.
So this final item was the addition that was mentioned at the board meeting last week for RSP to move forward and conduct their updated enrollment analysis this fall, and then the boundary analysis of all district buildings. Included in that boundary analysis will be the facilitation of public meetings and also the facilitation of a survey that goes out to our community. So we gather appropriate community input. So all of that is built into their process. The combination of the enrollment analysis and the boundary analysis is $57,400.
And this is for elementary and secondary.
Correct.
Seeing no other questions, I suggest we add that to the consent agenda for the next board meeting. That brings us to item 3 on the agenda, future agenda items.
So in August, we'll continue the conversation about the capital improvement plan. We'll also be discussing financing options for the construction that was discussed at last week's board meeting. And then we'll also be bringing forward a detailed program cost analysis.
Okay. Well, looking around at my fellow board members, I see no questions or comments, so I'll move to item 3B, the adjournment, and we'll adjourn the meeting at 6:25.
And then we will start the next board meeting at 6:30. We'll just do a quick turnaround.
Okay, I'd like to call to order the July 31st, 2023 special board meeting at 6:30 PM. Ms. Marsan, will you take the roll?
Yes, we do have a few board members joining us by Zoom, so hopefully they will be able to hear us and answer. Mrs. Bell,
Here.
Mr. Kuschert,
Here.
Mr. Lackner,
Here.
Mr. Lentz,
Here.
Mrs. McCabe, Mrs. McCabe, are you there?
Here, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Mr. McNally
Here.
and Mrs. Fairgrave.
Here.
Please stand for the pledge.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, and I understand there are no citizen comments, so we can move right to item 3 for action. Can I have a motion to approve the District 303 personnel report?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, Mr. Lentz and Mr. Kuschert, thank you. Is there any discussion? Seeing none. Ms. Marsan, will you take the roll?
Yes, Mr. Kuschert,
Yes.
Mr. Lackner,
Yes.
Mr. Lentz,
Yes.
Mrs. McCabe,
Yes.
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Mrs. Bell,
Yes.
and Mrs. Fairgrave.
Yes.
Okay, the motion passes 7-0. Can I have a motion to approve the contract with RSP and Associates for the enrollment and boundary analysis?
So moved.
Mr. Lentz.
Second.
And Mr. Kuschert, thank you. Is there any discussion? Okay. Seeing and hearing none, Ms. Marsan, will you take the roll?
Yes, Mr. Lackner,
Yes.
Mr. Lentz,
Yes.
Mrs. McCabe, Mrs. McCabe. Okay,
Yes.
Oh, there she is. Okay, thank you. Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Mrs. Bell,
Yes.
Mr. Kuschert,
Yes.
and Mrs. Fairgrave.
Yes.
Okay, and that leaves us with our final item, adjournment. Can I have a motion to adjourn the July 31st, 2023 special board meeting at 6:33 PM?
So moved.
Mr. Kuschert,
Second.
Mr. Lentz. Ms. Marsan, will you take the roll?
Mr. Lentz,
Yes.
Mrs. McCabe,
Yes.
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Mrs. Bell,
Yes.
Mr. Kuschert,
Yes.
Mr. Lackner,
Yes.
and Mrs. Fairgrave.
Yes.
And the meeting is adjourned at 6:30, still 6:30